The smoke hangs low over Gaza like a question mark you can't erase. Across the Gulf, streaks of light, missiles, rockets, drones, slice the night and leave politicians counting statements instead of bodies. Inside the glass-walled corridors of the UN, a tired delegate taps his pen and says, half to himself, "We have every word but no teeth." That line hangs like a verdict. Sanctions, resolutions, back-channel calls, and still the spiral widens. This episode begins as a mystery. Who wanted escalation, who wanted restraint, and why do the instruments of diplomacy keep sounding like pauses between battles? We follow scenes that feel almost cinematic. An Israeli command post plotting precise strikes, an Iranian operations room mapping proxy networks in Lebanon and Syria, a U.S. envoy juggling late-night calls, a map spread across the table, eyes rimmed with exhaustion. On the other side of the map, a fisher in the Red Sea watches a tanker reroute, and a shopkeeper in Aden counts the price of bread rising with every headline. The human detail keeps returning to one stubborn fact. Playbooks of deterrence meet asymmetric survival tactics, and the consequences spill into shipping lanes and markets. There are fingerprints everywhere. Supplied rockets, shared intelligence, coded messages through third parties. But fingerprints are not the same as motive. Was Tehran testing red lines? Was Israel signaling back to a domestic audience? Were U.S. warnings meant to deter or to reassure allies? Meanwhile, the Security Council debates while fronts shift. Sanctions are tightened, but leaks and workarounds turn them into instruments that punish civilians more than the strategists. Diplomacy becomes a theater. Gestures exchanged, cameras satisfied, but the real negotiations happen in basements and on battlefields. The whodunit isn't just who pulled the trigger. It's why the international system keeps failing to stop the next one. Is it a lack of power, political will, or impartiality? Or is the system itself outdated, written for a different century of statecraft? Tell me, which failure bothers you most? Drop your thought below, and if you want the full trail of evidence, how a single strike, a closed deal, and a missed warning stitched together the current escalation, subscribe and stay with us. Next, we trace that first critical spark and follow the paper trail that should have stopped it. The trail of clues widens the closer you look. In a dimly lit UN corridor, a tired diplomat folds a paper, voice low. We write strong language, then sign it and hope someone listens. Downstairs, the Security Council chamber gleams under cameras. A ritual theater where words meet vetoes. An American envoy leans into a microphone with practiced calm. We call for de-escalation, while behind closed doors allies trade maps and contingency plans. The ritual becomes the story's first puzzle. Why do statements fail to change behavior? Across the sea, an Israeli intelligence analyst stares at a screen showing flight paths and exploded wreckage. They're not aiming for total victory, she says. They're buying breathing room, building leverage. That breathing room is the same commodity Iran and its proxies value. Time to rebuild missile stocks, fortify underground workshops, test new drone swarms. In Beirut, a Hezbollah operative laughs when asked if sanctions bite. You think sanctions stop networks? They reroute. They adapt. This is a game of shadows. The game is asymmetric. State power meets decentralized actors who hide in civilian fabrics and global trade. Sanctions look neat on paper but fray at the edges. Shell companies, third-country brokers, and dual-use goods slip through ports and insecure borders. Even humanitarian exemptions become loopholes for equipment that later appears in missile programs. Diplomacy, meanwhile, fragments into bilateral deals and secret channels. Moments of quiet negotiation that sometimes cool fires, sometimes merely pause them. An Iranian negotiator in Tehran muses over tea. Talks give us room to breathe and to prepare. Backchannels are insurance. And then there's the calculus of deterrence. For Israel, every strike must signal capability without inviting wider war. For Iran, every proxy action must demonstrate reach without crossing a red line that triggers direct U.S. intervention. For Washington, the balance is political and military, domestic and international. Each actor treats diplomacy as part of strategy, not a standalone end. The result is a spiral where ceasefires are patches, resolutions are statements of intent, and warfare adapts faster than institutions. So who failed, the UN structure, the political will of member states, or the system's very design? If this thread intrigues you, hit like and stay with us. Next, we trace the money and the munitions, an intercepted shipment, a fixer in Dubai, and the fingerprints that tie front companies to frontline weapons. The story deepens like a map folded and unfolded a dozen times. In a dimly lit conference room at the UN, a draft resolution passes hands that tremble not from age but from calculation. If we push harder now, an ambassador whispers, we lose the vote. If we wait, the front changes. Outside, a janitor sweeps a corridor that still smells faintly of tear gas from a protest 2 days ago. Small human traces that diplomacy keeps trying to ignore. The mystery isn't a single villain. It's a pattern of deliberate pauses, plausible deniability, and mutual insurance policies wrapped in sanctions and statements. On one side, Israel's war rooms light up with satellite feeds and strike assessments. Officers speak in clipped sentences. Third salvo from the north intercepts high, civilian casualties low. Acceptable. On another, Tehran's commanders nod at maps marked with proxy coordinates. Hezbollah in Lebanon, militias in Syria, Houthi batteries along the Red Sea. Washington watches both, its carrier groups and diplomatic cables forming a twin spine of deterrence and restraint. Each player calibrates not just military effects but political fallout. Retaliation is measured like a chess move that must not topple the whole board. Sanctions appear everywhere, in frozen bank accounts, in delayed fuel shipments, in a Gulf port where a container marked medical supplies contains spare parts for drones. Yet sanctions also bend. Front companies, friendly states, and illicit networks reroute what the formal economy cannot. Weaponized diplomacy emerges in the pauses. Threats held like a hostage, relief promised as leverage. The Security Council becomes theater. Speeches, moral clarity, and then the inevitable veto that shifts the scene to bilateral back channels where real bargains are struck. But the human thread keeps snagging. A doctor in Gaza texts from a basement hospital. Supplies dwindling. A Lebanese farmer stares at a field scarred by last night's rocket fragments. Markets jitter. Insurance premiums spike. A tanker diverts. And a trader mutters that regional risk is now a line item on every balance sheet. The puzzle widens, every clue implicates a dozen actors. If this unsettles you, tap like and share your take. Is the failure rooted in lack of power, political will, impartiality, or is the whole international order simply outdated? Next, we pick up the forensic trail, satellite timestamps, intercepted orders, and the financial ledgers that trace who benefits when diplomacy pauses. The room smells of stale coffee and exhaustion. In Geneva, a tired negotiator rubs his temple and whispers into a secure line. They're not here to talk. They're here to buy time. Across the Mediterranean, a young commander watches the radar feed as a rocket arc fades into night. Around them, the same pattern repeats. Pauses called diplomacy, punctuated by calibrated strikes, proxy rockets, and a bilateral choreography that looks suspiciously like rehearsed escalation. The whodunit becomes clearer. It's not a single culprit but a network of motives. Tehran empowers proxies to bleed adversaries without overtly crossing red lines. Jerusalem punishes to deter and to signal resolve. Washington cajoles, threatens sanctions, then calculates political cost at home. Each act solves an immediate problem and sows the next. Sanctions, once the blunt instrument of choice, now feel like taffy. Stretched thin, easy to circumvent. Front companies, dual-use tech routed through third countries, informal financial channels. The anatomy of evasion reads like a thriller. At the UN, cameras show impassioned speeches while the Security Council deadlocks behind closed doors. The veto is not just a tool. It's a theater of power where messaging often replaces enforcement. Humanitarian appeals stack up against strategic interests. Corridors are negotiated as if they were bargaining chips. For countries on the ground, diplomacy looks less like rescue and more like a tactical pause to rearm. And then the spillover. Tankers slowed, insurance premiums jump, markets jitter at the opening bell. A merchant captain reroutes through longer waters, adding days and costs that ripple into fuel prices and inflation back home. Ordinary people feel it in their wallets. Diplomats feel it in polling numbers. This is why the question matters. Are we witnessing a failure of will of institutions or of the rules themselves? A quiet voice in a briefing room asks what every observer feels. Can sanctions and resolutions really compete with fighters who prize survival over legitimacy? If that strikes you as alarming, you're not alone. Which failure do you see? Impotence, partisanship, or obsolescence? Like If This Matters, and subscribe for the next segment, where we trace the weapon flows and map who fires at whom, and why each strike rewrites the strategy on the ground. The hall outside the UN Security Council room smelled like stale coffee and tension. A junior diplomat lit a cigarette in the stairwell. Metaphor, he joked, and slid a folded map across to an older colleague. "Look at this," she whispered, fingers tracing red lines where convoys cut through the Gulf and hull numbers blinked out of tracking screens. The map felt like a crime scene board. Dates, launches, retaliations, plausible deniability pinned with strings. That's when the pattern comes into focus. Not chaos, but choreography. Someone moves a proxy here. Another power tilts the balance there. A resolution is drafted, vetoed, then quietly rewritten. Everyone is talking. No one is stopping it. In this middle act, we follow the fingerprints. Satellite photos show trucks crossing deserts that aren't on any official supply manifest. Intercepted comms hint at coordination between groups that are supposed to be rivals. Sanctions, when they bite, are met with clever workarounds. Shell companies in the Caucasus, tankers switching flags mid-voyage, parts shipped in pallets labeled humanitarian. Weaponized diplomacy becomes an art form, a public denunciation in Geneva, a private phone call in Ankara, a quiet meeting in a Gulf palace where promises are made but not honored. The Security Council debates until the headlines move on. Meanwhile, launchers are reloaded. You feel the human arithmetic. Commanders calculating risk, leaders calculating domestic political cost, and intelligence officers cataloging the plausible deniability that keeps escalation just short of all-out war. In Beirut, a Hezbollah operations room pulses with the same grim efficiency we see in a naval command in Eilat and in a U.S. regional headquarters. Each actor treats diplomacy as a breathing space, useful, necessary, but never final. A senior advisor tells a visiting journalist, off the record, "Talks are pauses to reorganize, not to disarm." The sentence lands like a verdict. Markets register the uncertainty before politicians admit it. Crude ticks up after a missile salvo. Shipping insurance climbs after a tanker is harried in the Red Sea. For ordinary people, the consequences are immediate. Supply chains snarled, prices rising, a distant war edging closer. So where does that leave multilateral tools meant to prevent conflict? Are they toothless, politicized, or simply outdated for an age of proxies and asymmetric tactics? As the camera pulls back from that stairwell map, the questions pile up. Which failed negotiation mattered most? A missed compromise last spring, a veto that froze a sanctions regime, or the backchannel that was never opened? In the next segment, we trace those missed opportunities and lay out a timeline that might explain how we got here. If any of this struck a chord, let us know. And if you want the rest of the story, stay with us. Smoke and sirens have been our constant background music in this story. Over Gaza, across the Gulf, along the Red Sea. As a mystery, the case files are full. Intercepted shipments, shell companies buying components, encrypted channels between militias and Tehran, intelligence memos stamped, limited confidence. As a whodunit, the answer is unsatisfyingly collective. There isn't a single villain who could be arrested and the case closed. There are incentives stacked against restraint. Survival at home, prestige abroad, deterrence through escalation, and the practical fact that violence is often cheaper, in political terms, than policy compromise. Inside a dim briefing room, a UN official shrugs and says, "We pass resolutions. We name names." Then everyone goes home and someone sends another drone. A military planner across the table taps a map and replies, "Words don't stop rockets. Only radar and interceptors do." That exchange captures the core failing. The architecture of diplomacy can produce morality play statements but lacks the teeth to change on-the-ground calculus. Sanctions dent economies, but they also create black markets and resolve for regimes that view sanctions as existential. The Security Council can point fingers, but its fault lines mirror the fractures in realpolitik. vetoes, national interests, and competing alliances that convert global institutions into echo chambers rather than instruments of coercion. Look at proxy lines. Lebanon's hills, Syria's ruins, Yemen's coast. Each is a chessboard where actors test limits and learn what provokes disproportionate response. That asymmetry matters. A state with a navy and air force faces a group with missiles and tunnels. Escalation becomes unpredictable. And when backchannels are used as breathing spaces to rearm, diplomatic pauses turn into strategic respites. The costs ripple outward. Tanker routes get rerouted, insurance premiums climb, oil volatility spikes, global markets wobble, and a family in Lisbon or Lagos pays higher prices for a month's groceries. The human picture is simple and brutal. Civilians displaced, economies strained, and a diplomatic system repeatedly surprised by the ingenuity of evasion. So who failed? The UN's mechanisms, the moral authority of sanctions, the political will of key capitals, or the entire post-war order built on assumptions that no longer fit asymmetric conflict? Tell us which you think. If this episode helped you connect the dots, like it, leave your answer below and subscribe. We'll keep tracking movements, mapping proxies, and following the next ripple before the next flare-up becomes a wave.